In my talk, you will learn about how searchers interact with query autocompletion. And this is work that I've done in collaboration with my brilliant colleagues, Bhaskar, Milad, and Philip. So if you have used search at all, then you have seen query autocompletion. While you are typing the query, the system tries to guess what you are typing, and it helps you to formulate a complete query. So here, for example, the user is looking for something like information retrieval, and you see possible completions for that. We have seen query autocompletion integrated in web search systems in the last, let's say, 4 or 5 years. And from an information retrieval point of view, this development is very exciting because it finally gets us to start interacting with searchers before they see the result list. So in a lot of information retrieval research, people have focused on understanding how people look at results, how they pick the documents or the links that seem relevant to them. But there has been very little research on understanding how people come up with the query and what they do during formulating the query. And this is exactly what we're focusing on in the talk today. Let me first motivate the need for this kind of controlled experiment that we ran in this study. Query autocompletion can be very contextual. Depending on users' background, their location, they may be interested in many different topics. So for example, when a user starts typing a query SA, then depending on their location, we can already make a very good guess to what they might be looking for. In some previous work by Milad Shukui, they found, for example, that the query SACU is very common in Texas, and it happens to refer to a bank, the San Antonio Federal Credit Union, whereas if you start typing SA in Utah, you're more likely to be interested in the Salt Lake Tribune. So because the queries people formulate are so context-dependent, we cannot rely on training systems using global heuristics or globally annotated data. If you had to find annotators that tell you what the best query completions are for every person in every state in the United States or in every city in Russia, you would need many annotators indeed. And it's not possible to learn this kind of system performance just using those traditional means. That is the reason why we're interested in understanding how we can learn systems like query autocompletion online, directly using feedback that we infer from user interactions. In order to do that, we need to understand how people interact with query autocompletion. So this is why we developed this study here. Before we started this, these are the kinds of things we already knew about how people interact. And all those previous results were from observation studies. And in those observation studies, we can see correlations. For example, that people seem to engage more with query completions that are shown at higher ranks in the system. We had some information on how people's engagement changed with the prefix length, for example. And looking at data together with models, we could also make some inferences, is that me? About how people examine suggestions. Is that something I can do something about? No? All right. So in the example here, we can, for example, make some modeling assumptions about how people interact with query autocompletions, and then taken together with data, we can infer, for example, what suggestions people are likely to look at. The limitations of studies like these are that we need to rely on modeling assumptions. So just based on observation data, we cannot check whether those assumptions actually hold. And this was a motivation for us to run a controlled experiment. So in the study that I discussed today, these are the kinds of questions that we want to address. We wanted to understand how searchers examine query autocompletion, and how the quality of query autocompletion rankings affects examination and usage. Finally, we wanted to understand whether there is some position bias, so whether people tend to really trust suggestions that are listed higher, or if the correlation that we saw between click behavior and ranks is solely due to the fact that the suggestions that are listed higher are more relevant to the user. So in my talk, I will show you how we set up an experiment that could allow us to understand these behaviors. I will walk you through the experiment setup, and then I will show you how we analyzed the data. I will walk you through the results, and then there will be some space for discussion. If you have any questions throughout the talk, please feel free to ask at any time. Okay. The main point that we were interested in was how query autocompletion ranking affected user examination and which suggestions people used. For this reason, we designed two experiment conditions. The first condition is what we call the original condition, and this one showed users query autocompletions in the order that is decided by the production system of a commercial search engine, in this case Bing. In addition, we had the randomized condition, and here we would show people a permutation of the production suggestions, and we would pick the permutations uniformly at random. So when we started this experiment, we expected that if people have a strong preference for finding the right suggestion, so for example, if they start typing a query and then they select the query that they had in mind if it shows up on the list, then if we uniformly permute the ranking, then all the clicks, all the engagement with the suggestions should move to much lower in the ranking. And comparing the behavior between those two conditions allowed us to test that hypothesis. In our experiment, we counterbalanced those conditions. So searchers would complete a series of tasks, and in each task, they would be assigned to one of those conditions. We made sure that they never saw more than two tasks in the same conditions so that they wouldn't get used to either randomized rankings or original rankings. Now, what kind of tasks did we use? The challenge in designing the study was that we needed to create a setting where we had a lot of control so that we could keep variance down and actually make some statistical inferences. But we also wanted to study behavior that was as natural as possible. In the task design, we ended up with a setting where we picked a diverse set of 14 tasks. So we actually used closed informational and navigational tasks to achieve a high level of control. We made sure that we included some difficult to spell names. So for example, Arnold Schwarzenegger, because we thought that that might affect people's interaction with autocompletion. And we also included things like the Wall Street Journal that can be abbreviated. And you can see 3 of the tasks in the example over here. So for example, one navigational search task we designed was find the homepage of the Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston, USA. What is their physical address? One thing we noticed was that when we gave people navigational tasks like go to the homepage, people were confused about when they had completed the task. So for all the navigational tasks, we ended up asking them to extract some bit of information from the homepage. And they had to write down that piece of information so that for people participating in the study, they knew that they had actually completed the task. And that closure was something that we found was very important for participants in the study. An easy informational task was Japan is the 10th most populated country in the world, how many people live there? And we also designed more complex informational tasks where we assumed that people would need more than one query to complete the task, such as here, how many matches did Roger Federer win against Rafael Nadal in 2007? Okay. Now that we know what kind of tasks people had to go through, this is what the experiment setup looked like. We invited 25 participants into the lab, and we placed them in a normal office setting. So we had a computer, and the monitor that we used had an integrated eye tracker. The eye tracker we used is the TX300, Tobii eye tracker. And the kinds of things that we wanted to study are just about made possible with the technology that is available today, or that was available last year. This eye tracker has a very high resolution. For example, in terms of time, it samples eye movement 300 times every second. So we could really get a clear picture of how eyes move and how they look at suggestions. Also, the spatial resolution is very high. the eye tracker can achieve an accuracy of up to 0.4 degree of a visual angle. And the suggestions that we typically had on the screen had close to twice that size. So the resolution was just about high enough so that we could understand whether people were looking at a suggestion or not. All right. There were a couple of other things that we needed to design so that people would enter their queries in a natural way. In user studies of web search that have been designed so far, most often people started with a result page. So the query input itself hasn't been studied very much. One thing we noted here was that if we gave people a written instructions, then people would look at the written instructions, type a bit, look at the written instructions, and we couldn't get their normal eye movements during natural query input. So we decided to give them instructions directly on the screen. You can see an example over here. And people had to memorize the task before they could move on to the search engine where they were asked to enter their query. So in this way, we could ensure that people actually had to remember the topic, had to come up with a query, and had to formulate it in a way that we thought was as realistic as possible. And we checked this setup in a pilot study before we started the actual study, and that seemed to be working very well. Right. One more reason why we wanted to show the descriptions on screen was that we wanted to avoid people copy and pasting the query terms, for example. All right. Now I'll move on to the analysis. We collected as much data as possible while people were participating in the experiment. So for example, of course, the eye tracker kept track of all the fixations and saccades. So saccades are movements from one location to another. Fixations are when people's eyes stay in roughly the same spot. And during fixations, those are the times that people actually can pick up information. So it usually takes roughly 300 milliseconds before at least some information can be taken up during reading. So we keep track of all those. And we also we record those on the auto-completions, but also on other parts of the screen. We keep track of mouse clicks and keystrokes, obviously, during query formulation, the visited URLs. We have screen captures, videos of all the search episodes that we collected, and we collected all browser events. We then processed all those. So I mentioned we had 25 participants and 14 tasks, but some of the episodes had to be excluded because people felt too natural in the search environment, and they ended up not using the search engine that we asked them to use during some of the tasks. So for example, they might go directly to the Wall Street Journal homepage when they knew the URL by heart. Those cases we had to exclude. Other than that, we ended up with 331 valid search episodes, and we extracted 10 measurements from those, and I'll show you what those are in the next couple of slides. But first of all, I'd like you to show a video of what such a search episode might look like. Let's see if this works. So here you see the on-screen instructions. Let's see. You can see how the user is reading instructions. So here in this task, they're asked to find a web page where they can download Apple QuickTime. They press F10 and the search box shows up. They focus on the search bar, and we can see that the searcher here focused on the first 3 suggestions while entering the query and finally selecting the query Apple QuickTime download. Now, how do we analyze data like this? We ended up working with a lot of visualizations so that we could understand what is really going on. And I will be using this visualization a lot throughout the results and analysis. So I'd like to walk you through this and make sure that you understand what we're showing here. So in this graph, we're seeing user behavior over time. I'm here visualizing that we have search episodes that consist of a number of queries, looking at search results or search result pages, looking at individual search results, maybe going to type another query, et cetera, et cetera. So this whole period here I call a search episode, and the time it takes is the task completion time. For query auto-completion examination and query formulation, we only focus on the first query that people entered in each search episode. And that is, again, to keep variance down, because once people issued the first query, they did a couple of different things. Some went back to the search page and typed another query. Some went directly to a URL. So the variance there got too high, and we couldn't continue studying those later follow-up questions, follow-up queries. But then within the first query formulation, we have here a mouse click. So this is, for example, when the user focuses the mouse cursor on the search result, on the query box. You can see the green bubbles here showing which characters the user typed. So for example, TET. Black dots are control characters. So for example, delete. So then they type a test. This one is a space, and they type QUE. Then they look at the first query completion, second query completion, and here they again use control characters to select a query. So this is how to interpret these. Those gray bars here indicate that query auto-completions were shown at this point in time. And the red and yellow bars here at the top show fixations and saccades anywhere on the screen. So if you see those, it means that the user looked at the screen. When the bar is white, it means that they looked away from the screen, for example, at their keyboard. And when you see the bars at the top and the red bars here on the query auto-completion, then you see that they focused on some of the suggestions. Okay. We measured the things indicated here, so query formulation time, time to first fixation, and also some characteristics of the query and the completed task. For example, whether or not people used query auto-completion during formulating the query, if they used it at which rank the suggestion was, how many unique queries they submitted, how many unique search results they visited, etc. Okay. For all those measurements, we analyzed the data using mixed effects models. And you can see the form of these models over here. A mixed effect model works very nicely for our case because we have three main sources of variance in our data. There's the first, the fixed effect, which is due to the condition, the experimental condition that we want to study. So that means whether or not the user is in the original or the random condition. And this is really the variance that we want to measure. There are also two random effects, and those are due to participant and task. You could imagine that a participant that types more slowly will have a longer query formulation time overall than someone who types very quickly. But this is a source of variance that we want to model, but that we don't want to end up in our estimate for the difference between the two conditions. And you have the same for variance that is due to task. So if you have a more complicated topic, then people will generally spend more time searching for the right result, but we don't want to have this source of variance end up in our estimate of what the effect of condition is. To tease those apart, this is the model we use. So you see over here that we're modeling some function of the response. The response could be, for example, query formulation time, and all the timings are modeled as logarithmic response variables. So the link function here would be log for time variables, or log it for binary response variables. And then those response variables are considered as being composed of the following sources of variance. First of all, we have the base level. So this is our base estimate of, for example, how long it takes someone to input a query. Then we have the effect of condition. So there's some coefficient, beta 1, that shows how strong the effect is when people were in the random condition as opposed to the original condition. Next, we have the two random effects. So we have the effect of participant, and that would be a coefficient for each of the participants in our data set, and then an indicator to show which participant that measurement is for. Then we again have the random effect for task. So again, we would have a weight vector in which we have the estimated coefficients for each of the tasks, and an indicator that shows which task that measurement is in. And finally, there's the residual noise. So this is assumed to be random noise that is associated with the overall observations. Okay. Now, what are the results? I will discuss the results in 3 groups. First of all, I'll focus on measurement that we took during query autosuggest examination. Then I will look at query formulation, and finally, I will examine task completion. So during QAC examination, we are interested in the following 3 variables. Most of all, we want to know how long it takes people until the first fixation. And this is more a sanity check, because people shouldn't be aware of the condition they're in, at least until they have looked at the first suggestion. So we really do not expect a significant difference here. We also want to look at how much time people spend examining suggestions overall. So this is the cumulative fixation time. And here we split that into a 2-stage model, where we first look at whether they looked at suggestions at all. And then if they did look at suggestions, we also model the time they spent examining suggestions. These are the things we found. So for the n here, this indicates over what part of the data this measurement is taken. If a variable was analyzed for the whole data set, then we have 331 over here. But then this number can be lower. For example, here we only analyzed people that looked at suggestions, and those were those 284. Now, for each of the measurements that we took, we have some value for the coefficient associated with that measurement. And here, to make this easily interpretable, I also translated that into the actual estimate for that particular parameter. So here we see that people are very likely to look at suggestions. And in fact, 97% is the estimate for people actually examining suggestions at some point during query formulation. We can see that the effect of condition here is not statistically significant. And in fact, there's a slight negative trend that people were slightly less likely to look at suggestions in the random condition, but this is very likely due to chance. For cumulative fixation time, we can see that people are estimated to, on average, spend 1.2 seconds looking at suggestions. So this is a very that's quite a large proportion of the time they spend to formulate a query. And again, we see that these estimates are very similar under the 2 conditions. So it's not very likely that people change their examination strategy due to the condition that they're in. And finally, we looked at time to fixation. So this, as I mentioned, is a sanity check. Again, we see that these values are very similar, and condition does not seem to have a statistically significant effect here. So this seems that indicates that our condition was not noticed by the users. Okay. The results here were very surprising, because we thought that the 2 conditions we used were quite obvious. As you remember, in the random condition, we showed people a uniformly random permutation of the query autos completion suggestions. And we thought that people would very much notice this and change their interaction or their examination of suggestions. And here we see that this didn't happen. We were so surprised that we focused on this in a breakout, and we tried to understand this some more in the graph over here. Here you can see the time that people spend fixating on suggestions in each of the 2 conditions, and you also see the usage, so how often they clicked or used arrow keys to select a suggestion in each of those conditions. And this is split out over suggestion rank. So you can see that in both conditions, people spend close to 600 milliseconds examining suggestions at the first rank. They spent roughly 500 milliseconds examining suggestions at the second rank, and this very quickly degrades, and they only spent, on average, 100 milliseconds looking at the suggestions ranked very low. We can see that the difference between the ranks is much larger than the difference between the 2 conditions. So in our study, we concluded that the ranking that we present suggestions in does not have a strong effect on how people examine suggestions. Okay. So this indicates that there is indeed a strong position bias and that people expect to see the most relevant suggestions at the top, and that they very quickly give up if they don't see suggestions at the top, and that they're not very likely to go further down in the list to find the query that they're trying to type. Okay. Now that we've characterized suggestion examination, we'll look at query formulation. So do we see any changes here? In query formulation, we focus on the following variables. We look at the time it takes people to enter the query formulation time, and we look at some characteristics of the query length over here, whether or not people have used query auto-completion to enter the query. If they used query auto-completion, we also look at the number of characters they saved by using a suggestion. And we also look at the rank of any suggestions that they might have used. Okay? And these are the results we get for this case. We again see that there is a slight trend for query formulation time, but again, this may be due to chance. So there's no statistically significant difference in query formulation time due to condition. We see that the query length is the same. In both conditions, people enter roughly 25 characters. There is a trend to use suggestions less in the random condition. Again, this is not statistically significant, and this might be because the variance we see is very high here. So it could be that if we collect more data, we actually would see a difference here. We do see a difference in the number of characters saved, and it took us some time to understand what's going on here. In the original condition, people save on average 9 characters. So the length of the query that they type and the suggestion they use is very similar. There's only a 9-character difference. However, when they use query auto-completion, this goes up by 2 characters. So on average, they save 2 characters more. This is surprising because we saw that the actual length of the submitted query does not change. And we found that the difference is that people don't spend time finding those shorter, easier completions. So in cases where the suggested query is very similar to what they were trying to type, this is ranked lower under the randomized conditions. And those are cases where people just don't end up using the suggestion. They just end up typing this because probably it's more effort to actually go and find the suggestion in the ranked list. For the rank at which queries suggestions are selected, this is on average 1.4, so people tend to select the highest ranks, as we already saw, and this is again very similar under the random condition. So here we can see that during query formulation, there aren't major differences in terms of how long it takes people to formulate a query, but we see some effect on which queries people actually submit. And this is indicated, for example, by this statistic of characters saved here. So now that we saw that people may submit different queries when they are in the random condition, we look at task completion and whether that is affected by the query auto-completion condition they're in. So in this last group of results, we focus on the following task completion metrics. We look at the time it takes people to click on the first result. We look at the overall task completion time. And here we would expect that if somehow people used lower quality queries when they are in the random condition, that it should take them longer to complete a task. We also look at the number of unique queries and the number of unique result pages they look at. And number of unique result pages is conditioned on having visited a result. The reason that we need this step here is that in some cases the answer that people were looking for is directly shown on the search result page, so they don't need to actually visit a result to answer the question. And these are the results that we get here. We see that people enter roughly the same number of queries in both conditions, slightly more than one. We see that they're not very likely to find the answer they're looking for directly on the search result page. There are only 3% of people who find the answer directly on the search result page in the original condition. 2% find it in the random condition. We do see a significant difference in the number of unique results that people visit. And that again indicates that people submit different queries when they are in the random condition, and that in fact the quality of the queries is lower, so that they have to look at more search results to actually find the answer that they're looking for. So that's shown over here. In the original condition, they on average look at 2 results, and in the random condition, they have to look at 2.4 results, which is, for this average, that is quite a big difference. Task completion time we see is not affected, so people's, oh sorry, this is the time to first click after submitting the query. So it takes people roughly the same amount of time, a bit more than 5 seconds until they decide which result to click on. The time to task completion time greater than TS. TS here is a threshold, a timeout that we put, and people had to complete their search task within 3 minutes. So this binary variable here indicates whether people finished their task within the allotted time. We see that in the original condition, 4% of the tasks were not completed in time. This was twice as much in the random condition, but we don't see a statistically significant difference here, probably because those ratios are just too small. But this might indicate a trend that people are, again, less successful in finding the right answer when they are in the random condition. Finally, task completion time is, again, very similar across the conditions. On average, people took slightly more than 1 minute to complete a task. Okay. So to summarize, the main results we found were that query auto-completion examination does not seem to be affected, or at least does not seem to be affected much by the query autocomplete ranking. However, we did find differences in the types of queries that people submitted, and the submitted queries seem to be less effective when people are in the random condition. So the main difference that we find is that query autocompletion rankings affect the effectiveness of the submitted queries. In the next part of my talk, in the discussion, I'd like to do 2 things. First of all, I want to walk you through a couple of examples of how people actually enter queries. And finally, I want to discuss how our findings may relate to how we can measure the quality of query autocompletion in an online setting. So let's look at some examples. This is very similar to the visualizations that you've seen in the past. And you see 4 query formulation episodes over here. Let's look at case A, first of all. So here we see a user who is touch typing. And we see that by having this red bar that's almost continuous over here. So this indicates that the user has been looking at the screen continuously while typing the query. And we see what we term a form of monitoring behavior. So they seem to be roughly aware of what the suggestions are that are shown at the top of the result list. And it looks like they are comparing what they're typing to the top suggestions. Here they type down, they made a mistake here, download Apple QuickTime. And even though they are aware of the suggestions that are shown at the top, they don't actually end up using a suggestion. So it's possible that their query, the query that they type, was influenced by what was shown at the top, but they did not explicitly engage with the suggestion. Okay. 2 interesting cases are compared over here. So in both cases, the user tried to enter a query that's related to Arnold Schwarzenegger. So remember, we picked some of those complex names to understand how spelling support, for example, could influence how people use suggestions. The contrast between those 2 conditions is quite high. In the first case, we see that the user, again, was touch typing. However, they didn't seem to know how to spell Schwarzenegger. So they typed Arnold S, and then there's a break. We see some examination of suggestion. We see some control characters. So here they use the down arrows to select the next word for their query, to get the query to Arnold Schwarzenegger. After that, they knew how they wanted to complete the query, so they actually typed the remaining words. So they typed sworn into office date, and they didn't use suggestions there. So it seems like this user was specifically looking for suggestions to give them some spelling support to understand how to spell this name correctly. In case C over here, we see someone who doesn't touch type. So as you can see, they briefly look at the screen early on when they focus on the query box. And from then on, we don't see any fixations on the screen until they have finished typing Arnold Schwarzenegger. So this is quite a feat. They managed to type Arnold Schwarzenegger completely correctly without any typos, without looking at the screen. And you can also see that this user is typing very quickly. So the time it takes people to type is not necessarily an indication of whether people touch type or not. So we have someone typing while looking at the keyboard, but then they have typed Arnold Schwarzenegger and they don't know how to continue the query. And this is what we can see over here. They try to actually formulate a query. So this is quite a different usage scenario from the spelling support. Here we have someone who wants to figure out how to verbalize their query intent. And we can see that here they look up at the screen and they look at all the suggestions in order. They find that the right completion is not yet there, so they type California, and then they again look at the top suggestions and find that California governor is the completion that expresses their intent, so they use this particular query. Okay. Finally, we have a pattern here that we found quite surprising when we looked at this data, and that is this upwards pattern. Usually we assume that there is position bias because people type while looking at the query box, and then once in a while they look at the suggestions below. But here we have someone who is not touch typing. We have someone who's looking at the keyboard while typing 2007, Nobel Prize, and then they look up at the screen to understand how they can complete their query. And then we see that they examine the suggestion in reverse order from bottom to top. This is something that happened in our data for 10 of the users, at least once. It wasn't a pattern that happens very often, but this indicates that the order in which people examine suggestions can be reversed from what we usually expect them to be. Taken together, these patterns allow us to understand why we're seeing the kinds of position bias we have in our data. Most of the users we saw, or more than half, were touch typists. So they type the query, they look at the query box while typing, and once in a while they look at the suggestions just below to kind of monitor whether they're typing the right thing or to see whether they can save some time by having a quick down arrow and select the query. There's a second use case where people look for ways to complete the query to express their intent. So there we have this explicit seeking behavior. And this is quite different from the monitoring, because here people stop, they actually take a break in typing, and they look down at the suggestions to see which one can help them. And finally, we have this less frequent upwards pattern where people look up from the keyboard and scan the suggestions as we go along. Okay. Now that we have some understanding of how people interact with query auto-completion, I'd like to take a few moments to see what you think about whether and how those insights can help us evaluate query auto-completions. So imagine that we have two different systems that we show to users that, let's say, rank suggestions in different ways. What can we measure to understand whether one system is doing better than another? What I've listed here are some of the proposals that people have made in the previous literature. Very popular are what we call rank-based metrics, where people look at suggestion logs, they look at what people have typed, and then they check at what rank that would appear in the system that they have developed. And then the intuition would be that if suggestions show up higher in the suggestion system, then that system would be better at answering people's needs. Another proposal was to look at query autocompletion usage. So just to take a look at how likely people are to use the suggestions, for example. Other work looked at a more manual approach. So they didn't look at logs, and instead they asked judges to examine suggestions and tell them which ones would be most helpful for the user. A fourth approach looked at result page quality. So they looked at the search results that would be shown for each of the suggestions, and then they evaluated, for example, in terms of NDCG, what the quality of the result would be for the intent of the user. And the fifth suggestion that I want to mention are so-called effort-based metrics. For example, minimal keystroke length, which measures how many characters a user has to type until they can submit the intended query. And I'd like to open the floor up to you. So what kind of ideas do you have, based on the insights that we just gained? Are there any metrics that you think would be more appropriate or less appropriate for measuring the quality of such systems? Any ideas?
Could you please return to the slide where you had this graph with bars and positions in? So it seems like there is no difference whether you show the users the ranked results or just random permutation of the suggestions. Does it mean that the users are so stupid that there is no difference for them, or what?
Not necessarily stupid. So I think that it's a function of the attention that people pay to different suggestions at different ranks, and that if people don't find the right suggestions towards the top of the list, they have two choices. Either they just continue typing the query and they just type the query that they had in mind, or they select a suggestion that is maybe not exactly what they were looking for, but that's close enough. That close enough is why we might have seen differences in search effectiveness between the two conditions. So this would indicate that people still use suggestions, but they don't use the ones that they would have chosen with a different system.
But the good suggestion is there. I mean,
yeah, so in our cases, it was a permutation of suggestions, yeah. It was very interesting, actually, to look at the eye tracking videos and see what people actually noticed. So if people looked at, let's say, the second suggestion, they're completely unaware of what is written at suggestion 5 or 6. So even though it is right there, and you could say, just look, it's right there. And people really aren't aware of this. So their choices are either continue typing or take a query that is towards the top, and that's maybe suboptimal for their query intent.
Yeah, hi. Maybe you could make your method have a great resolution if you don't just permutate the top 10, because these are already very good suggestions. You start writing Mesa, and it's Massachusetts, but maybe you start typing Mesa and is going like massage and all kind of stuff. Maybe you'll get more contrast result, more resolution in metrics, because right now I didn't see the difference between the suggestions, because I don't know what's the main topic in the region right now, and that's how you may make it more visible for users that the random variant is like crap. Thank you.
Thanks. So in the maybe I can explain a bit about how the original system works. So the main idea there is that queries are sorted by essentially their popularity. So more common queries would show towards the top, and the intuition would be that more common queries are more likely to be the ones that people are looking for. So there's no grouping in terms of intent. So you wouldn't have all Massachusetts queries together, for example. In the condition we had here, people really were not consciously aware of the two conditions that we tested. So the ranking was really something that we could study without people noticing that this is something that we were interested in. It would be very interesting to, well, we definitely need to make query auto-completion systems better, but it's not obvious how that necessarily should be done. And this question of how to evaluate and train the systems is something that we need to address in parallel. So, we don't have that perfect system yet where we could compare to this is a perfect system and this is a really bad system. We have the system that's the current state of the art, and all we can try to figure out is whether we've developed something that is better or worse than what we currently have. It looked like the biggest effect we had was in terms of task completion, that people really submitted lower quality queries. So that's basically the comparison that we can make so far. That's fine. I think, Pavel, you had a comment?
I have two questions. The first one is about the slide where about task completion. And it seemed that people spent less time on clicking on the first result when they had worse results. Mm-hmm. Well, which we could expect that it would take more time for that. So why do you think it happened?
Right. So if I understand your question correctly, it was about this time to first click.
Yeah.
So that was a small difference, and you're right, the tendency was for people to make that click decision slightly quicker when they were in the random condition. I'm not sure if this is just noise or if that's actually a trend that indicates that there is a difference. One intuition I have is that if search results become lower quality, people start behaving more randomly. So they end up just clicking on the first one because they can't really figure out what the right result should be. And this again would go along with our conclusion that the results were actually of worse quality when people were in the random condition.
So they were more position biased in this case.
Yeah, on the search result page, they seem to be more position biased. Yeah.
And another thing, did you think that, it's from your description, it seems like that people acted like the results were okay when they were randomized. So they kind of they use their old habits. And do you think that if you gave them more time, they would sort of adapt to the random condition, they would act differently from after some time? Did you try to study their behavior in the beginning and at the end? Was it different?
Right. So there's two components to my answer here. First of all, the fact that people seem to not really change their behavior when the search system deteriorates. That's something that we also see in web search overall, that in many lab studies, people have reported that when the search results were of lower quality, people actually blamed it on themselves. So you would get comments like, I don't know what happened, I couldn't really come up with the right query, but they usually don't attribute this to problems with the search system, which is very interesting. People somehow expect search engines to do something very well, and they're not really aware of, they don't really have a good indication that this is a bad system, this is a good system. They don't really compare it that way. So in a way, what we saw in query formulation here is very similar to that people just continue with how they are used to interacting with the system, and they don't really change when the quality of the system degrades. The long-term question is a very interesting one that I'd like to study in the future, but our study was really not set up in a way where you could get to those kinds of longer-term effects. As I mentioned earlier, we made sure that people only saw up to 2 search tasks in the random condition, and that was exactly so that they couldn't get used to one condition versus the other. I think that people may very well learn, and I think that's what usually happens, that people adapt to the search interface or the search system that they're using. So I would expect that we would see changes in behavior over time. Okay. If there are no comments at this stage, I'd like to just wrap up about possible ways in which we can measure QAC quality. Like you mentioned earlier, it seems that rank-based metrics can be very misleading because people didn't seem to change the degree to which they examined or interacted with suggestions at lower ranks when we degraded ranking quality. So it seems that evaluating based on rank-based metrics can be very much misleading. I mean, we need to be very careful when we use this for evaluation. Things like QAC usage seem to be promising. So even though we didn't see a significant difference in QAC usage, we did see a big drop, and it seems like the main reason we didn't get those differences are that the variance was very high. But overall, I think this is a promising direction. Manual judgment of suggestions could be very, could give us very focused information, but in contrast to web results where at least to some degree annotators can tell us whether a result is relevant for query or not, this becomes very hard for query auto-completion. And I've seen that judges who try to make the decision very easily are misled by trying to interpret what the intent of the user was. So this doesn't seem to be very reliable, and it doesn't really seem to be a very promising way to get towards those contextual and personalized patterns that we're really trying to pick up here. Result page quality seems to be a direction that's particularly interesting, especially because we've seen that task completion and effectiveness was affected the most in our study. Finally, effort-based metrics did not seem to make a big difference. You can very easily manipulate the length of queries that people submit just by putting longer queries towards the top, and this would end up getting people, to save more characters, for example, but it wouldn't necessarily indicate that we have developed a very good system. Finally, I wanted to make 2 comments on so-called live comparisons. So in this study here, we invited people to a lab. So it was a very elaborate lab-based setup where we could examine users' interactions with the system in detail. A very promising direction is to look at controlled experiments on the web. And 2 of the technologies that can be used here are A/B tests, where you show one half of your users one system, one half of your users another system, or interleaving, where you combine the results from 2 systems and you try to understand which system would be preferred by the user. Both of those types of controlled experiments require that we better understand how people interact with QAC and how we can measure the quality of those systems. To summarize, in the talk today, I have shown a study that examined how people interact with query auto-completion. I showed that there seems to be strong position bias, so that people examine suggestions, are more likely to examine suggestions that are towards the top of the list, and they're much more likely to engage with those, even when we degrade ranking quality. We did see some effects of query auto-completion ranking on search effectiveness. So the suggestions we showed people seemed to affect more what kinds of queries they submitted than how they submitted those queries. There are many interesting directions for future work, and integrating our findings with evaluation and learning setups for QAC is just one of those directions. One thing that I would be particularly interested in is trying to understand whether we can train a system that infers some of those examination behaviors from log data. So for example, looking at the traces that we have collected in this study, can we understand how we can detect that someone is pausing to look at suggestions? And that seems to be very promising looking at the data that we have already. With that, I'd like to close my talk, and I'm open for questions. Thank you.
One of your slides contained an equation, and the last component of that equation was a residual noise. And did you try to analyze this noise? What kind of noise? Is it white noise, Gaussian noise, or something else?
So the assumption of the model is that the residual noise follows a joint Gaussian distribution. We did do the standard tests to analyze whether that is in fact the case, and that seemed to be happening here.
Because sometimes what we consider as random data can contain some valuable information.
Sure. I mean, that is always the case, right? All models are wrong, some are useful, and that is definitely the case here. In the model that we set up, we try to make the model complex enough to capture what is most likely to play a role in our data. We did go through a series of comparisons where we tested more complex models to understand whether there are, for example, interactions between task and participant that aren't appropriately modeled here. We found that those more complex models did not do a better job in modeling the data that we had. So we concluded that we're capturing enough complexity for this analysis. But of course, if you had more data, you could tease apart more and more of the factors that introduce variance here, and it's very likely that you would be able to find additional relationships.
Thank you.
Thanks for the talk. Well, you noticed a couple of interesting facts that, okay, users don't pay attention much to the real quality of the suggestions, right? Users, well, on average, they start from the top, they look at 1, 2, 3, and then they kind of give up. What is your opinion? How far we are from the limit where there is not much we can do about improving suggestions, when the improvement would be non-visible for the user? Like, if there is much in this area in general to move onwards, especially if we have all these nice rich logs and millions of previous queries.
Right. That's a very interesting question. And I don't know if there's a hard and fast answer. My own intuition is that we're still very far away from giving perfect query formulation support. Most of the systems today rely on mostly frequency of queries in log data. So you can come up with a very good global model that on average models the characteristics of your population well. We know very well that if someone starts typing FA, they probably want the Facebook homepage, so this is very easy. What's very hard is to understand what those context factors are. What are the things that are popular in a person's location? What aspect of their background and maybe the things they have looked at in the past are relevant to try to understand what they might be interested in at the moment? And I think we're still very far away from correctly capturing those contextual factors. I think the difficulty there is that those are very hard to study with the kinds of manual judgments that I mentioned earlier. So we really need to develop those online experimentation methods at the same time as we develop those new methods for taking user context into account. Just looking at the suggestions that I get when I type a query, I think there's still a lot of room for improvement there. But it's, as you say, very hard to figure out, whether we're halfway there or close to 80. I mean, yeah, you really cannot put a number on that. There's one in the back.
This might be a tricky question, and I don't expect you to answer honestly, but if you look at the Google search suggest and instant search, because it's very tightly knit and it's very like two welded products, and do users act differently there?
That's a very good question. We explicitly excluded something like Google Instant here because we wanted to focus on this effect of suggestions on how people formulate query. I agree with you that having Google Instant would definitely change that behavior. There was one earlier study where people looked at just the number of queries that people submitted without suggestions, with suggestions, and with Google Instant. And there they mostly found that for people it becomes easier to look at many different results and kind of continuously reformulate the question or the query until they have something that they're interested in. I think if you want to evaluate something like Google Instant, you run into the same kinds of problems. You need to understand how people interact with the system and what kinds of signals you can use to indicate whether your system is doing something better or worse. Intuitively, it seems like task completion time, for example, could again be something very valuable there. But this is really an open area, and there hasn't been a lot of research there.
So, does anybody else have any questions?
Okay, thank you. My question is, okay, I use this searcher help, and the question I ask is usually, okay, the system helps me these quite similar words, and I want to know if the help will be rather different, and okay, it may be I want to search for beautiful flowers, our sunflowers, but maybe I want to have not similar words, something like this. What about quality of such research?
Mm-hmm. Right, so if I interpret your question correctly, it's related to this query formulation support, so helping you figure out what the right query is to express your search intent. So from the study that we found here, it seemed like people are very susceptible to following the suggestions of the search engine. So if you see a suggested query that is somehow close to what you have in mind, then people are very likely to follow that. And I think that that is something that isn't taken into account very much. So people look at what kinds of queries are common, but they don't really model which one is the best one for you at this point in time. And I think there's really still a lot of research needed to understand, how to model query effectiveness for a given user in a given context. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I guess then we can finish here. So I propose you to thank Katja again for her talk.
Thanks.